Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're here today because, well, we're going to tackle something huge. We're going to demystify two massive, really foundational concepts in sociology and anthropology that try to answer one of the biggest questions out there. Why do human beings actually behave the way we do? We're diving into functionalism and structuralism. Now, I know those sound like dry academic terms, but stick with me. They are essentially two completely different lenses for decoding the hidden rules of human society. It's really fascinating stuff. Okay, here's our visual roadmap for this explainer. We'll kick things off with the purpose of culture, take a look at defining social structure, and then dive deep into the structuralist mind. After that, we'll explore decoding human myths, apply that to the grammar of Genesis, and finally wrap up by looking at some flaws in the framework. Let's jump right in.
So, starting with part 1, the purpose of culture and how it fulfills human needs. All right, to really ground ourselves in physical reality here, I want you to ponder a bit of a behavioral puzzle for a second. When you look back at human history, why is it that completely isolated societies, people separated by vast oceans or impassable mountain ranges, why do they end up building incredibly similar cultural institutions? Why does pretty much every group on Earth develop family units, economic systems, and religious beliefs?
Well, anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski gave us our first major clue to this puzzle with his theory of functionalism. Through his really revolutionary immersive fieldwork, literally living directly with the people he was studying, he came to a massive realization. He concluded that culture isn't just a collection of random traditions or accidental habits. Actually, culture is a highly effective tool. It exists specifically to meet the basic biological and social needs of human beings.
And this breakdown right here illustrates his point brilliantly. Malinowski basically split our needs into two camps. On one side, we have our basic needs, our raw biology, right? We need nutrition to survive, safety to avoid harm, and reproduction to keep the species going. But then, on the other side, we have our derived needs. Because we literally need nutrition to live, we build complex economic systems to distribute food. Because we need safety, we create laws and systems of social control. So he essentially connected our most primal biological survival directly to the creation of these complex cultural institutions.
Moving on to part 2, defining social structure, or what we can call the invisible framework. Now, building up from those physical institutions we just talked about, we enter a much more abstract domain. Notice how this hierarchy begins at the very top with society. It's an abstract system of interrelated concepts, which is then divided into social institutions like family, religion, and the economy, exactly the things Malinowski was talking about. But look at how it filters all the way down to statuses and roles. This invisible framework determines how we all interact. You aren't just an independent, free-floating actor. You occupy an ascribed status, like your age or gender, and an achieved status, like your occupation. This whole framework places limits on our behavior and organizes the very fabric of society.
Which brings us to part 3, the structuralist mind and its hidden logic.
Now, we're doing a bit of a pivot. We're moving from visible, physical behaviors to the deeply psychological world of French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, who gave us structuralism. He argued that society isn't just a network of visible relationships, rather it's a reflection of the unconscious universal structures of the human mind itself. To explain this, he relied heavily on an analogy from the linguist Ferdinand de Saussure. Think about how you speak. You can probably speak your native language perfectly without consciously thinking about the underlying rules of grammar, right? Well, Lévi-Strauss argued that culture works the exact same way. Societies enact cultural traditions and myths without consciously knowing the underlying structural grammar of their own minds.
So, the absolutely crucial point here is that according to Lévi-Strauss, the human mind basically runs like a computer processing code. Because of our innate cognitive limitations, we rely heavily on binary oppositions to make sense of the world around us. We understand things by contrasting them. We literally only comprehend what light is in contrast to dark. We understand culture purely in opposition to nature. This binary coding is the hidden, universal engine driving all human thought.
Let's dive into part 4, decoding human myths and overcoming contradictions.
So, how does this underlying binary grammar actually manifest in real life? Well, through our stories. For Lévi-Strauss, a myth's purpose isn't just casual campfire storytelling. It is a highly functional vehicle used to transmit messages. A myth provides a logical model for the human mind to overcome a real-world contradiction. And because human minds are universally similar across the globe,
He argued that myths operate via universal transformation rules, meaning a myth from one culture can actually be structurally transformed and mapped onto a myth from a completely different culture.
Let's look at a pretty mind-blowing example of how this comparative power works. Levi-Strauss looked at totemism among relatively simple Australian Aborigine societies, where people use nature, like associating a group with a specific bird or animal, to differentiate themselves from one another. Then he looked at the incredibly complex Indian caste system, which uses culture, specifically occupational divisions, to differentiate groups. Now, on the surface, they look entirely different, right? But structurally, they achieve the exact same goal. By creating artificial differences between fundamentally similar humans, both systems force groups to interact and exchange with one another, whether that's exchanging marriage partners or economic services.
All right, Part 5, the grammar of Genesis, focusing on oppositions and mediators.
To see how this mind code works in a story you probably already know, let's look at how anthropologist Edmund Leach applied this structural analysis to the book of Genesis. Leach viewed the biblical creation narrative as a perfect textbook example of binary coding. On day 1, God creates static oppositions, heaven versus earth, light versus dark. By day 4, these become dynamic oppositions with the sun and the moon. Leach extrapolated this as the ultimate contrast between life and death, and fertility versus non-fertility, represented ultimately by Eve and Adam. Basically, the human mind is constantly, obsessively categorizing the universe into these stark, opposed buckets. But here's the catch. Stark binary opposites create tension, right? So how do we resolve that tension? Through what Leach called mediators, or liminality. These are clever little categories that bridge the gap between two opposed concepts. For instance, between the domestic cattle on one side and the wild beasts of the forest on the other, the Bible introduces creeping animals, creatures that basically occupy an in-between status. Leach also looked at the firmament bridging the waters above and below, or even festival rituals as liminal time that bridge the gap between the past and the present by temporarily reversing all the normal social rules. Mediators are basically what help our minds comfortably process all these contradictions.
And that leads us to our final section, Part 6, Flaws in the Framework, or the Cracks in the Code.
Now, structuralism is incredibly elegant, for sure. But as with all grand, sweeping theories, we really have to examine the cracks in the armor. For instance, impartially looking at the critiques, scholar Michael Carroll argued that analysts like Leach were basically forcing their own binary logic onto texts where none actually existed. He noted that in Genesis, creeping animals don't really share traits with cattle or wild beasts. They're really just a third category, not a true structural mediator. Furthermore, feminist critics strongly objected to Levi-Strauss's assertion that the entire foundation of social structure was the exchange of women between groups, arguing it reduced women to mere objects of transaction. Finally, Marxist and materialist critics pointed out that structuralism is entirely ahistorical. It looks at systems perfectly frozen in time, completely ignoring the messy, dynamic, historical realities of how societies actually transform through material inequality and conflict.
Which brings us to a final kind of lingering thought. Structuralism offers us a breathtakingly clean mathematical view of the human mind, while functionalism grounds us in our primal, basic needs for survival. But, as we've seen, no single theory perfectly captures the entirety of reality. So, I leave you with this. When you look at the traditions, the myths, and the structures of your own life, are you just playing out a rigid, unconscious binary code programmed into your species? Or is human society something far more fluid, historically driven, and beautifully chaotic? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning the hidden grammar of your world.